So good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable. Welcome to some new faces. Fantastic to see you with us. Welcome to some older faces who've been with us for a number of the journey we've been on over the last 2 years. To those who don't know me, my name's Matthew Baird. I founded the Social Housing Roundtable during lockdown when people were asking me questions that had nothing to do with recruitment because no one was hiring. And instead going, hi, Matt, we're trying to do this. Do you have anyone in your network who's also doing X, Y, Z? We're using contractors to do our safeguarding for the first time. We're working from home. We've got mental health issues. What can we do? So tried to just bring people together. And over the last couple of years, we've grown into this community of more than 600 people. We have got a YouTube channel now that's got more than 50 recordings on it. We've got them on Spotify. It's growing and growing, and it's absolutely brilliant. And to anyone who was able to join us at the live in Manchester as well, you know, it was a phenomenal event, and I really thank everybody who could join us and who could be there. My day-to-day job is a recruiter. I've been doing social housing recruitment for 12 years. And the reason that this is kept free is because so many people who have been on these roundtables have either been candidates of mine or have been clients of mine. And so because so many of you have used me for that service, I can keep this free. So the longer that we can keep that going, the more of these we can run. Please do go check out recordings and things of previous episodes. And if you want to get involved with later ones in the year, please let me know. So on to today. Jennie, Blake and I met last year, I think probably via LinkedIn is where I meet most of you these days, which is amazing. Actually, some people I met at a live event recently, which was weird because I'm like, what do you mean we met in person? But Jennie and I met on LinkedIn last year, and we had a session last year on burnout that was incredibly well attended. Again, it was kind of toward the end of August, but brilliantly attended toward the end of last year. And we've run a session earlier this year on trauma. It was more of a general overview of trauma and what's going into, you know, this sector, why it is traumatic, why we've got to embrace the fact that it's traumatic, and why we've got to kind of do something about it. And what we realized through that session is we needed to do a deeper dive on staff trauma in particular. We know there's trauma for our tenants. That's something we've talked about, and I will definitely come back to. And this is why we needed kind of 2 deeper sessions on each one. But today's session was focused on the staff trauma and the realization that it's okay to kind of say this is a traumatic sector, which sometimes is a difficult thing to do because naturally in housing we are people who go, it'll be fine, and we just get on with it and we carry all the weight. On that, I'm going to pass over to Jennie to introduce herself. She's a hell of a trainer. If you've not met her, please reach out, and please do kind of have conversations with her after this event. But for now, I want to kind of pass over because it's an incredibly important session today. If you do want to make introductions in the chat, feel free to. If you want to ask questions or raise points in the chat, feel free to. But after the presentation, this is always a platform for an open discussion. And I don't mind if you're someone who's brand new to customer services or frontline work in social housing, has been doing it 2 weeks and has a general query, or if you're a chief exec of 20 years, your voices on this platform are all equal and always will be. So without further ado, Jennie, over to you to introduce, I guess, today's session.
Yes.
What we're going to go through and the topic. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thanks for having me back here again. It's lovely to see you all. Some of you I know, some of you I don't know, but we will know each other by the end of this session, no doubt. So my background is predominantly in supported accommodation. I'm now freelance, I'm self-employed, so I work now as a wellbeing consultant and core skills trainer in the public and voluntary sector. I work with lots of different organisations, but like I said, my heart is in supported housing. I started as a volunteer 26 years ago. I shouldn't tell people how many exact years there is because it gives way too much away about my age. But yeah, 26 years ago, started as a volunteer, has worked as a support worker. I have managed teams of support workers. I've been a senior manager in organisations in the homelessness sector. And I basically burnt out in 2020 at the end of the first year of the pandemic. I just couldn't cope. I couldn't do it anymore. It was too much. And that has led me to starting my own business and delivering training, working as a consultant in the sector. So I'm also a hypnotherapist and solution-focused practitioner. So I do have a therapeutic approach that I bring to my work. And I kind of add a bit of a flavour to my training around that. And that's why I can talk about this now with you all. I have got some slides today to share with you all. You've got the slides on the screen now, but this is a discussion, so please feel free to jump in if you want to add anything, and I will ask all of you some questions as we kind of progress as well, because I really would like to have that discussion going. So to start with today, I want to really introduce some research to you. So there was a study done this year, and I'd be really interested to know if any of you have seen this or if you've heard of it. You're all off camera, so I can't see. Like, if you can get your cameras on, you can wave at me and say, yes, I've heard of this, or no, I don't know anything about this. So it'd be lovely to see your faces if you do get cameras on. But yeah, there was some research published this year. It was published in March, so this is really, really recent. And it was solely focused on post-traumatic stress disorder, secondary traumatic stress, and burnout in frontline workers in homelessness services. So give me a wave if you've even heard of this piece of research, because it's quite groundbreaking. Matt, I'm glad you have. I've definitely told you about it. Anybody else aware of this? No. Okay, honey, great, you know about it. So very few people, and this is one of the reasons that I've wanted to talk about this so much. It's really, really important stuff. It's been published. I'll share a link to the research in the chat before we finish so that you can have a look at it yourselves. But it was published in the Journal of Social Distress and Homelessness. Now, I think it's really important that we look at this research because it's literally the second study ever in this country that's been done that specifically looks at trauma being an occupational risk for frontline workers. And I don't think the data that it's produced kind of shows us anything we don't know. If we work in the sector, we know this stuff already anecdotally. But what it does do is it gives us kind of proof. Okay, it's done the research, it's proven data. And I think that's going to really help us as a sector start taking a better and more honest look at occupational risks for our staff and start thinking about what do we need to do about it? You know, what can we do to protect staff members? What can we do to prevent this from happening? How do we respond to this? So really, really important research. Before we, there's some messages in the chat. I should probably have a look, shouldn't I, in case there's any questions.
All good at the moment.
Okay, we good. All right, good.
Fran had said she's a social worker since 2018. She's experienced burnout. She hadn't heard of this, but Michelle has heard of it. It's like you say, I think the awareness of it is one of the real problems, Jenny.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I take you into the research, I'm going to share with you 3 case studies that are kind of real life case studies. I mean, they're so real life, they are from organizations that I've worked in. Because I think it's really important to ground ourselves in what we know already. You know, if we work in social housing, we are familiar with this already. This isn't kind of, you know, completely new information. So I'm going to give you some case studies and just get you to think about how we perceive these incidences, if you like. So let's have a look. I've got 3 here. The first one is actually a good friend of mine. She's an agency worker. She found a customer collapsed on the floor in his accommodation. She called emergency services and she was advised to give mouth to mouth to the customer until the paramedics arrived. The paramedics didn't arrive for 25 minutes, so she was given mouth to mouth for 25 minutes. She knew that he was already dead, and the customer was, of course, pronounced dead when the paramedics arrived. So she kind of talked to me about it afterwards and kind of said, you know, I was given mouth to a dead body for 25 minutes. I mean, really, really disturbing experience. So that's case study 1. Case study 2, we had a 28-year-old team leader. So he was like the deputy manager of a really large service in a very busy, very busy scheme, if you like. A 21-year-old customer had stabbed himself in the neck and throat 28 times was the report that we got back afterwards. The police had knocked on his door and he had an incident, essentially. Team leader, so that 28-year-old team leader had to go through his belongings to find documentation. Obviously, he was sectioned. There was stuff that we needed to get to him in the hospital. And the room, if you can imagine what that might look like, somebody stabbing themselves in the neck and throat 28 times, it was a bloodbath. It was just absolutely horrific. And that 28-year-old had to go in there and kind of search through stuff and find belongings for the young person. And then case study 3. and I hope this is, I should have done a disclaimer, shouldn't I, at the start? So this might be a bit triggering for people. This is all very, very disturbing stuff, and I apologise. But these, like I say, are real life scenarios. We had a brand new manager in post, literally, I think she'd done 2 months in post. And a young person who lived in her service was stabbed outside of the service. He staggered into reception. He was bleeding out. She tried to keep him alive. He died in her arms on the floor of reception. So these are just kind of, commonplace, I would say, commonplace kind of incidents that we might experience in the line of duty. I use that expression intentionally. But are we calling these experiences traumatic? So this is where I'm going to hand over to you for some questions. Would you call these case studies traumatizing? Would you call them traumatic experiences? I'm seeing some nods from those of you who've got cameras on. Yes. Anyone, feel free to put a hand up on your icons, on your emojis, or put anything in the chat. Yes, everyone's saying, of course. Yes, absolutely. Okay, let me ask you another question. Do you think that any one of those 3 staff members ever said, I feel traumatized by this? Do you think that they used that language when they were explaining or describing the incident that they'd just been involved in? Do you think that they used that language? I feel traumatized. That was traumatic. What do you think? Yes or no? No, probably not. In the chat, maybe not. No, yeah, no, they didn't. They didn't. None of them used that language. There's a possibility perhaps in their private life they may have used that language. I'm not sure. They didn't use it in the work context. Another question for you. Do you think the organization recorded these situations, recorded these incidents as anything other than incidents for the customer? What do you think? Yes or no? Do you think that was recorded in any way as anything other than an incident for the customer?
Nope.
Let's have it. Nope. What have we got in the chat? Probably not. They should have. Probably not. I'd really hope so. Larita's saying
Michelle
yeah.
said they would have done in our organisation. Tony said that the shock factor is obviously a part of it. Francis, it depends how familiar they are with recognising the language and the experience. A lot of no's. So yeah. It's definitely varied, but more no's than yes, and probably not, but I'd hope so. Seems to be the other mindset. Michelle said we have a violent incident report in our organisation, and those things can make a huge difference.
Yes, it can. So this is one of the things that the research will go on to show us, that how the organisation responds to these things makes a real big difference. But yeah, in these 3 case studies, the organisation recorded that as a serious incident, but that's recorded as a serious incident and attached to a customer record, isn't it? Whatever kind of database you're using, it might get sent to, it's sent to various people, but it's very customer oriented, of course. But there's no official documentation, there's no official record that's been kept or recorded for the staff member. So there's not been a note put on their staff file. There's not any kind of place where that's been recorded as a traumatic incident for the staff member. And I want to ask you now then a little bit of a follow-up question around your own organizations. So how does what I've described correspond with your experiences in your organizations? Is this commonplace? Is it commonplace to have incidents like these? Is it commonplace for there to be a lack of, language that would be considering the staff experience in these situations? Let's have a look what's in the chat. Michelle saying we ask if they feel supported by our organisation on the form. Is that for the customers? You ask for the customers or the staff member?
No, they said before that they monitor, take action against customers and report to executive team. The incident form also asks what level of trauma has been experienced by the colleagues. So
great.
They're very thorough, which is great. Andrea said, I worked on the counter at the old benefits agency. Violence was an everyday occurrence.
Yeah.
Michelle said just not quite as dramatic. Ifeoma has asked, why is that though? I'm assuming that was to your previous point. Michelle, I was working for another organisation. A colleague was assaulted. No action was taken whatsoever against the attacker. And I certainly know of a business which have got a housing options team that are massively understaffed at the moment and are taking 40, 50 cases a week on rather than the 20, 25 they're meant to be on because they're part-time. And she's saying that nearly every other call is to do with suicide. And
Yeah.
that's become just normal everyday practice. Andrea said there, I was assaulted with a gin bottle in my face. Nothing was offered to support me.
I'm so sorry, Andrea. That's awful. That is, it's not okay. And I would think, I mean, I haven't heard from all of you here, but I would, at a guess, suggest that it seems to be quite difficult to apply the word trauma when we're talking to staff. You know, we talk about it a lot in the sector now, which is great as it applies to our clients, our customers, which is of course appropriate, and as we must. But we seem to find it really difficult in applying it to the experiences that our staff members are having. And I'm really curious to just explore why we think that might be. What do you think? What do you think that might be about? Any thoughts? Oh my goodness.
I think it comes across as weak, doesn't it? Unfortunately, or that's the mindset anyway. You know, Alison's mentioned there that found a body hanging in a cupboard. Andrew said I'm much softer these days. I was rock hard then, and that's part of the problem, I think, is the fact that we're meant to be rock hard. We're meant to kind of go, this is the job, don't show emotion, just this is part of it, without kind of going, well, let's do something about that. Alison, do please come in.
Yeah,
I suppose I've got two takes on this, because I'm a trustee of an organisation where things, you know, similar to the stuff that Jenny's described in her case studies can and does happen. And then in my younger days, I was in what you call mainstream housing management, where the stuff happened, but it perhaps wasn't, you know, quite on this level in terms of the intervention that was expected. And I wonder if there's a difference in that tolerance. I think certainly in mainstream housing now, I mean, I think there's a lot more, oh, well, if you can't get access, you need to ring the police and that kind of thing. But when you're in a service, whereas many of the services where I'm a trustee are like, oh, where you're, you know, doing sleepovers, or, you know, it's a particularly challenging client group. And I think there's almost, I'm not saying it should be different, but I think there's perhaps a more preventive approach in general needs, or there are ways of avoiding these situations, whereas I think in supported housing there isn't.
Yeah. I mean, I think some of these situations are going to be unavoidable with the client group that we're working with, and with the lack of, you know, because there's been so many cuts across society, it means that people with higher support needs are entering services, so that it's going to be present. It's what organizations then do with it in order to support staff. We must start acknowledging it. So for me, I feel like there's a lot of organizations that aren't even verbalizing it. They aren't even naming it. And if we can't name it, we can't treat it. We have to start acknowledging it. We have to start talking about it in order to properly support our staff.
There's a point in the, go on, Alison.
Sorry, there's just one other point from where, I mean, obviously, because I'm just a trustee, I'm not desperately familiar with how all the logistical stuff happens on the ground, but my perception is where there's something that happens that perhaps affects a number of staff, you know, a big incident, and there's lots of staff on duty, then we get reports about what happened, and that's obviously dealt with as a kind of serious incident thing. But I'm not sure when it's maybe just one staff member, whether, you know, and it's just about the individual, whether there's a different way of handling that. But that'd be interesting to explore.
It would. I mean, this is a subject that endlessly fascinates me. So I feel like we could have a lot more conversation. There's some amazing comments in the chat.
I was going to say, there's a brief overview. So Francis has said we have a CF50 form, for instance, to be recorded, also access to free counselling. I've supported managers. But then a really interesting point, Jenny, was luckily I haven't experienced anything that violent or traumatic, but I worked with a customer with severe complex mental health issues, which I'm not trained in, and that took its toll. And this is nothing against the point that you've made there, but that is traumatic, and it's okay to call it that. Vicky, we will place a marker on the account in housing and a safe register for all other departments to be aware that might require a 2-person visit. We would refer concerns to management and HR. We have an employee health assured scheme. We have had a couple of incidents where staff have been attacked, which has been racially motivated. Also verbal written communication too, and we supported our colleagues to report to police and followed up with court and resolution. Katie, our urgent support teams in domestic abuse leads are given regular counselling sessions. Brilliant to see. And we also offer counselling and wellbeing referrals. Andrea believes she's changed as a person. I think I've maybe become worn down by my customers over the years. The society has changed, which isn't for the better. And Michelle said they also have mental health first aiders on site, which is maybe going to be the other discussion we're going to have. Jenny,
Yes.
not going to deep dive into mental health first aid.
No. I've got some things to say about mental health first aid, but I'm going to come back for another session.
Yeah.
That one.
So,
yeah, definitely.
But I think some of those points being made there that kind of, it hasn't been that violent, it hasn't been that traumatic. I think that's maybe the mindset where housing struggles, and maybe that's where managers who've been through and weren't given support, and senior managers who weren't given support when they were coming through, don't think to give to support to other people who've just going through what they've been through. Because you have to just get on with it. And I think that's maybe the struggle in the housing sector as a whole.
Totally agree with you. I think we do have a culture overall across the sector where we have almost kind of a stiff upper lip, this kind of everything's fine, and you earn your stripes and you've got to be pretty hard, and you deal with it. And maybe that is going to work for some people, but I don't think it's very healthy when we're dealing with really traumatic experiences. I think we do need to break this down a bit and be open and say, actually, this has affected me. But I'm going to link this to another conversation, Matt, that we had in one of the other roundtable discussions, and I can't remember what it was now, but we were talking about how maybe our customers or our clients find it difficult to acknowledge that they're traumatized. And I remember asking at the time, or making the point at the time, that we expect our customers to say, I'm traumatized, or these experiences that I've had in my life have been traumatic. And we recognize that it's difficult for them. We need to also recognize that it's difficult for staff too. Like, it's hard to recognize, it's hard to say, I feel traumatized, I might need some help here. So there's just something here in this kind of area that we need to start breaking down and saying, you know what, this is traumatic. I think I don't know what positions people hold in the room, but if you are a manager, if you're a senior manager, we need to start saying it's okay to feel traumatized by this. It is a traumatizing experience. This was a traumatic situation. So the more we can do that, the more we can give our staff the language and the tools to recognize it and to get help for themselves if that's what they've experienced. We're going to have to move on. I want to show you the data, or some of the findings of the data, and we'll have a little bit more discussion after that. So I think this is really interesting. The study has found that people working in frontline, I mean, they were looking at frontline homelessness services, so not more broadly, but I think this applies really across the board. The study found that people working in frontline homelessness services are frequently exposed to primary trauma, which is workplace aggression, crisis situations, that kind of thing, and secondary trauma, which is hearing about other people's traumatic experiences. And the important thing here is that this is directly linked to these, I've just popped them up on the screen underneath, these forms of traumatic stress disorders. So we already know that people working in frontline services are exposed to trauma. We know that, right? There's nothing new within that. But what is new is that this study is directly linking them to these work-related distress disorders. Okay, there's 3 there. So post-traumatic stress disorder, secondary traumatic stress, and burnout. In fact, within the study, we've got some stats for you. For those of you who like the numbers, 23% of the sample met the threshold for a PTSD diagnosis. 23%, that's almost a quarter of the sample met the threshold for a PTSD diagnosis. 27% of the sample had high levels of secondary traumatic stress. So again, really high figure. And 30% of the sample had symptoms of burnout. I think that is a huge amount of people that are hitting those thresholds. And again, I want to reflect this back at you and just want to get you to think about this. Think about your own staff teams right now. So could you consider, like, is it possible that a quarter of your staff members maybe are meeting the threshold for PTSD diagnoses? What do you think?
Just from the chat, a couple of points before as people are typing. Michelle's a tenancy enforcement coordinator, deal with the most complex of cases for all organisations. Andrea has put a post up about how she had a terrible time with little training, 12-month ASB case that went. She felt that was failing. Then she felt she was failing a family that she was trying to support, had to leave, took that with her. Others, there's a couple of messages there saying that I think, PTSD is something that's being carried forward. And Vicky put earlier, I think a concern is that incidents may be minimized as staff become somewhat desensitized as we are dealing with more and more complex cases, so may not see it as traumatic.
I think that's hitting the nail on the head. I really do. I think we are desensitized. Yeah. Absolutely agree.
Being told that that's what you're meant to be, almost, you've just got to get on with it.
Yeah, absolutely right. Are there any more in the chat? There's so many great comments in the chat there. I've had there's some really traumatizing experiences actually being mentioned.
Yeah, I'm trying not to maybe kind of, someone they'll place a mark on the account in housing, safe registers. I think there's lots to be do from a safeguarding perspective. And Andrew's just put there, I think most senior managers minimize the experience of staff and just offer you the baseline support with no tangible action. And a lot can depend on who you work with. This is from Alison, i.e. colleagues willing to do joint visits. Yeah. And I think it's important to, and I imagine this comes up on your training, that distinction between trauma and safeguarding. And they are two different things that we need to really kind of focus on.
Yeah, we will actually talk about that in relation to the mental health first aid situation as well, actually, because I think that comes up quite a lot there. I really just want for all of you to be able to just think about, actually, are staff experiencing trauma to this level where they may be experiencing PTSD, secondary traumatic stress, or burnout? I think that there are lots of initiatives on offer in the workplace at the moment. Like we've mentioned already, mental health first aid might be one of them. It might be that you have reflective practice, clinical supervision. You may have, I think some of you have mentioned in the chat that we've got in-house counsellors and that kind of thing, which is fantastic. Organisationally, it would be really worth knowing how many people utilise those services, because often these things are on offer and people are not taking them up. I know reflective practice is one of those ones, particularly if it's group reflective practice. There can be teams who just don't have a culture of wanting to share in that way. People don't want to sit in a group scenario and talk about how they're feeling. Again, it comes back to this idea of perhaps they feel like it might be a sign of weakness. We've just got to get on with it. It's not helpful. That kind of thing can really impact on the effectiveness. So it's okay that it's great that it's being offered, but if it's not effective, then there's no point. So that's just really kind of want to get you all thinking about, okay, so what's on offer in our organizations around this? What are we doing? How are we talking about this? And how effective are the interventions that we are offering for staff? Let's move on to some of the specific risk factors. So the study really helpfully identified some specific risk factors. So that is things that are happening in the workplace that are likely to increase the likelihood of a staff member experiencing trauma, or for it to then develop into one of those stress disorders. So these are some of the compounding factors. These are some of the kind of the risk factors, if you like. And there's a couple, because I'm going to show you in a moment some of the protective factors. So some of the things that we can build in, some of the things that we can do to protect our staff members. And some of them are a little bit contradictory, which is interesting, but we'll have a look at this. So one of the risk factors is exposure to trauma. Who knew? And I think there's something there about kind of repeated exposure. So where there's repeated trauma, there's more likely, or there can be an increased risk then developing PTSD or secondary stress. Things like, what else have we got there? A focus on hard targets. We are working in a commissioner-led sector and in a commissioning-led environment. That can lead to a focus on hard targets rather than supporting our customers where they're at, or some of the kind of the softer things that we need to do to support our customers. Where there is that focus on hard targets, staff members are often working in conflict. They've got to do things, they've got to tick things off, they've got to submit reports, they've got stats to worry about, they've got compliance to worry about. They're not necessarily having the time that they need, the energy that they need to focus on the support needs, if you like. Of course, we're working in a sector where there's a lack of resources. That's going to have an impact. You know, I was an area manager in my previous role, and we had services who were carrying things like 11, 12 vacancies at a time. You know, entire shifts were being covered by agency workers. That's going to increase the likelihood of stress, and if there are incidents, perhaps trauma on members of staff who are carrying the load of a shift, perhaps. We've also got their maladaptive coping strategies, which I think is really important. So this is where we might have individuals who are utilizing things that aren't helpful. It might be that they're finishing a shift and going and getting drunk because they just can't, you know, cope with the stress of the day. It's not looking after themselves. It's not being aware of their own personal kind of needs, and they're not inputting in their own well-being, if you like. What else have we got there? I think it's fair to say that we've got some conflict in the sector for support workers between being the support giver, the caregiver, and being a gatekeeper. You know, there's a kind of an ideological conflict there. I think a big one is emotional suppression. So the study found that where people are just getting on with it, you know, we're not acknowledging it, we're brushing it under the carpet, where staff are doing this stiff upper lip thing, you know, that is an indicator that we're more likely to experience PTSD or STS or burnout further down the line, because we're not expressing it, we're not getting it off of our chest, we're not processing it. There's some other factors there. We've got high staff turnover is another indicator. Inexperienced management. I thought that was really interesting to mention, actually, because again, I think one of the things we do see in our sector, because we have a high staff turnover, I think that there is, and correct me if I'm wrong, any of you, feel free to jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that what we tend to do is we over promote support workers. We'll promote them quite quickly. They're doing well in their role. We've got management vacancies. You know, it's great that we're keeping them in the organization, but there are consequences of promoting people too soon if they're not ready, if they're not experienced enough to manage the team. And that plays out in terms of how they can then support the team when there are traumatic experiences or situations. What else have we got there? Negative appraisals. So where people are not getting kind of positive input, they're maybe there's conflict with their managers where they're not getting positive support throughout the year and in their appraisals, that can also lead to those stress disorders and burnout. Any thoughts about any of these that have popped up from any of you?
I've got I think there's one around the inexperienced management that I really agree with. I think part of the problem is, well, I agree, you know, it's sometimes promoting too quickly. I think it's the fact we promote people because they're good at a job, not because they're good at being a manager. I think it's a big issue.
Yeah.
And when we talk about high staff turnover, it's always difficult necessarily to mention something like this with a co-host such as yourself, and it certainly isn't a personal slight, but the amount of people the sector has lost over the last 3 or 4 years in particular, who are people who have burned out, who have been overpassed for opportunities to be promoted, who have tried to change a culture from within and just not done it, and then gone to be consultants. I've never known it be higher, and it is happening so regularly. When we did the live roundtable in Manchester, the amount of people who joined who had been in housing for years and were either leaving or looking at setting up their own businesses or who had already done that. And we're losing so much talent and people who know how to deal with the day-to-day.
Yeah.
But that's a big culture part of housing as a whole.
And
like you say, I mean, someone had put there, I think Francis said that the compounding factors are good, particularly the focus on hard targets. There's a long-term chronic health condition there, so that would be affected. And Michelle said the lack of resources is massive. The workload generally just pushed onto the other ones already under pressure. And these things are just compounding more and more in a sector which has never been more difficult to recruit in. There's never been a higher need for staff. There was a thing that came out today that said vacancies are dropping all the time, unemployment is high. It isn't in housing. There's loads of vacancies, loads of people are trying to recruit. But they need experienced staff, and that's where the biggest issue is. And just before we kind of move on to the next point, Andrew Hart had said that he worked in a housing team that had been running short of staff for the last 12 months. Down to points where we had half the team we should have, the expectations we still must achieve excellent customer service. And therein lies the problem. You've had the new standards come out in terms of you know, customer service standards that have just been released. You've had new tenancy service measures. You've had the white paper and everything else that goes with it. But the cultures of housing are having to change so quickly because suddenly they're being told this, that they now can't get the staff. And all of this is just meaning you get more and more pressure put on you.
Yeah.
So those things which in the past, I think, I can't remember who it was mentioned, they feel like they're less resilient these days.
Yeah.
A lot of that could be down to the fact that actually you're under more pressure than you've ever been under.
Yes. Yeah. Totally agree with that. Totally agree. The research did, oops, somebody coming in, should we just meet them? There we go. The research fortunately also listed a number of protective factors, and I think this is worth having a look at as well. So I'll share this with you now. So these are mechanisms which protect staff from being overly traumatized by their workplace experiences. So these are things that we can consider building in some way. Remember I said that there were a couple that might be a little bit contradictory. We've got one there, the top of the slide, dose exposure. So that contradicts the idea. So it's like exposure to trauma can be a good thing. It can be a bad thing. So for some people, the more experiences they have of traumatic incidences, the more they grow resilience, you know, the more the more they do kind of get used to it and can cope. But for others, that dose with that kind of steady dropping of trauma, it can have the opposite effect. It can build up their stress levels and can lead them to burnout. So that's a kind of a dual diagnosis, if you like. Really interesting. We've got some really, really good ones here. Compassion, satisfaction. So the study made quite a lot of this. It's the idea, of course, that we may be experiencing compassion fatigue in lots of ways in our work, and that adds to our trauma. If we can create a culture at work where we feel like we're contributing positively to people's lives, if our support workers feel like they are making a difference to their customers' lives, they won't experience so much compassion fatigue. In fact, they'll have compassion satisfaction. They'll feel satisfied by the work that they're doing. This is something organizations need to be doing something about. This is something that we need to have some conversations about. We've also got there a sense of control over your work. So if support workers feel like they have some control, I mean, actually, this isn't just about support workers, this is about managers too, but it's well known in the field of mental health, wellbeing, work, that if people feel that they have some control over their role, some control over the job, some control over the work that they're doing, they will feel more satisfied with their role, their stress levels will be lessened. So how can we do this? How can we encourage this? There is, of course, something about personal resilience. So yes, there has to be a focus on what organizations are doing to support staff, but hand in hand, it needs to work with what are we doing to help individuals manage their own well-being, because we all have to take some personal responsibility for this too. It's not purely the role of the organization to look after our well-being. We need to input positively as well. So there's something in there about how we do that. I've mentioned there the PI approach for staff, so that's a psychologically informed environments. Again, you know, some organizations are doing this brilliantly and some aren't. So I can't make a massive generalization, but I do think that there is more of a tendency to consider psychologically informed environments from the customer perspective rather than from the staff perspective. So if we can just expand that to include the experience and perspective of staff members, then that's going to help quite a lot. We've got positive organizational cultures. I mean, if I got you to all wave and said, anyone ever worked in an organization that had a negative culture? I'm sure you've all had a story at some point where you've worked in a negative organization, and that really impacts massively. You'll all know that. It impacts massively on your own sense of well-being, but directly then that links to your potential to fall into a stress disorder or burnout. What else have we got on this list? Emotional intelligence. So yeah, where we are talking about these things openly, where we have that self-awareness that, wow, that incident actually has knocked the stuffing out of me. You know, it really has. It was traumatizing. I need a bit of time out for this. If we can encourage that in organizations, that's really going to help. Where there's an organization that has strong values and that live by their values, again, I think that's linked to the compassion satisfaction as well. People know that they are contributing, they know that they are living out their values and working in an organization that has strong values. We're not just here for the money. You know, that kind of attitude, I think, is a massive protective factor. Similarly, having a learn, not blame. I think that's really linked to the positive organizational culture. So, you know, some organizations have a real kind of negative blaming culture. If people do something wrong, they feel that they can't own up to it. They feel that they can't be transparent, but they've got to cover it up because they're going to get blamed, they're going to get into trouble. It's really unhelpful. It's really unhealthy. Where we can develop a culture of learning, of transparency, where we all hold up our hands and say, well, I've made a bit of a mess up here. How can we put this right? You know, how can I learn to do this better? That's going to massively contribute to somebody's stress levels. And then having a focus on well-being. It's obvious, but it's true. You know, if we're not talking about this stuff openly, then we're not going to make any headway. We're not going to make any progress. We need to have a focus on staff well-being because we know we're working in an environment where there is high level of trauma. We need to talk about it. Right, there's some comments in the chat. Shall I have a quick look? Anything in here? And what are your thoughts about these protective mechanisms, everybody? What are your, you know, do you think these are in place in your organizations? Can we do better on any of these? What do you think?
There's been a post from Andrea who said, I think some organizations become arrogant when staff leave. They say they care, but in reality, they know they'll recruit quite easily, but they recruit with little experience. I think that's beginning to change because people are having to realize how difficult it is to recruit now. And Vicky has followed that by saying we have 1 in 3 teams that had vacancies and haven't been successful in recruiting from housing backgrounds, but have had transferable skills. It's not just the case for estate management, but other areas of housing too. We then have a period of intensive training. That brings with it challenges unto itself, I agree, but it is, you know, when we're talking about resilience, when we talk about mental health, it's something we have to be aware of because this is going to keep happening. Vicky said managing expectations and what can be realistically achieved, given complex cases and staff resourcing, coupled with the social housing, covered with the social charter coming in, which puts an even greater pressure on housing than there's ever been previously. Andrew, I think well-being in some organisations is just telling people to take their lunch hour and doing 9 to 5. I'm sure you yourself. Ellie, I think a lack of these protective factors was part of the reason I became one of the experienced managers that left to go out and consult and coach. You aren't alone in that. There's a huge group of you that have done this. It's there's no blame on it, but it is what's happening. Alison, lots on well-being, but not too much around trauma. It's all meditation and stuff, but not she's dissing that she's a Buddhist, but it's not dealing with trauma. It's putting yourself in a calmer space. And Michelle, our business has 800 employees, so it's very difficult to make sure everyone visibly lives our values. Our values are defined and printed on our walls all over the building. And Honey, regular staff survey need to understand how staff feel. Culture is fundamental. So when staff leave, do your exit interviews and learn from those mistakes. Don't do them as a course of practice. Carolyn, you've got your hand raised. Do please come in.
I was just going to make an observation about the protective factors slide, and I think positive organisational culture is really important, and that's the one that often people struggle to make an impact on. I think trauma-informed practice is really, really important, both delivering that to your customers or your tenants as well as each other. And I think that lack of understanding around trauma and the impact of trauma, and the fact that often people carry trauma that's historic and may not want to share, but it's still part of their makeup and their DNA. And we often find that with customers where we're struggling to engage, they're providing us with a lot of challenges. And the reason we're struggling to engage is because we're not trauma informed and we don't know how to work with them in a way that they need us to work with them. And so we make it harder for ourselves because we put people into a box that we expect them to fit into. And, you know, for whatever reason, they are never going to do that. So we really need to focus on the whole person, both staffing wise and customer wise, and that requires more time. It requires more in-depth relationship building and partnership working. We may not be the best person to work with that person, so we need to identify who that is. We need to be professionally curious about our customers and each other and supportive to each other. We need to be compassionate as well and have empathy. But in today's environment where we've got we're under such a spotlight nationally and locally within our own organisation, that's very, very difficult for that change in culture to take place. And so we're kind of hitting a brick wall, I think, with it, and we're not really sure how to react. And so we're not reacting particularly well, which is why you see people leaving in droves.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely
just
right.
my take on it. My take on it. Sorry.
No, I think you're absolutely right, Carolyn. I think you're absolutely right. And there is so much that we need to do. And I just think, listen, looking through the comments that people have written in the chat, I've just I've just lost all my slides. Reading through the comments in the chat indicate there's so much more that we can be doing, I think. And it's not the kind of putting on a well-being hour at lunchtimes. It's not having a yoga class or a meditation session. It's a whole organizational approach, and it's about looking at the culture. It's about really bringing in this trauma-informed practice as it applies to everybody. There's lots here. It needs an overall plan. Actually, this links to Honey's point here, which is around regular staff surveys. So one of the organisations that I've worked with for 3 years, and I've done a survey every year with them around their staff wellbeing. And now it's amazing because we've got 3 years worth of data which shows the staff journey. We use the first year's worth of data to create a wellbeing strategy, and every year we kind of ask people, okay, is this working? Is this not working? What are your current stresses? What's this like for you? And now after 3 years, you imagine the amount of data that I've got to really have an understanding of how staff are doing, how they're feeling, what's working for them, what do they need, what has the organisation done that's actually been really helpful, what's not worked, what's been rubbish. It's incredible, but it's so valuable as a process to go through that and get their input into that, because that kind of information can then lead the organizational culture. It's a treasure chest of information. We've got another message in the chat. Okay, yeah, exactly. You've got the fantastic, Jackie. You've got fantastic kind of initiative there in terms of getting that information. And then it's important that we actually do something with that information when we get it.
I was going to say those are the two things. Firstly, it's doing something with it, and it's great to read that, like Great Place to Work and Thrive surveys twice yearly are brilliant. I think there's also an issue though around, as we've discussed earlier, self-awareness.
Yes.
So people might go, yes, I'm stressed, but no, I'm not facing trauma.
Yeah.
Because you don't realize yourself that what you're going through is traumatic. Have we got
Absolutely.
many more slides? And we're into the last 10 minutes, Jenny. So I just want to make sure we don't run out of time.
Last one. It's a conclusion. So it's the last one. So for me, the single most important conclusion is actually that the study is saying trauma is an occupational risk in the sector. I think this is fascinating on so many different levels. I think there are lots of different sectors who have trauma as an occupational risk. Think about anyone working in any emergency services, for example. If you're a train driver, it's well known that if you're a train driver, it's an occupational risk that you might be traumatized. The military, there are lots of sectors which openly acknowledge this. I don't think that we are there yet. I don't think as a sector we are honestly and openly saying that trauma is an occupational risk. But this study is showing very clearly that it is an occupational risk. Now, this study alone, it can't make us reflect, can it? It can't make us reflect as a sector, but it has given us some information that we can take away and analyse and assess, okay, what do we need to do next? And what do we do with occupational risk? What do we do with any other occupational risk? Anyone? What do we do with this normally? If this was any other type of risk in the workplace? Yeah. We would create risk assessments, and we would create risk management plans. It's simple health and safety stuff. We would put something in place. And what I'm suggesting is that we use this information that's coming out of this study and others to start risk assessing trauma. It's an occupational hazard. Let's name it. Let's write a policy. Let's have some procedure around this. We have lots of things available to support our staff members. I don't think it's being applied always. I don't think it's all effective. I think we need to have some kind of concrete planning around this. What other conclusions were there? Okay, so it's important to offer a range of protective mechanisms, which we've just had a look at, which develop individual personal resilience as well as changing organizational culture. So, we've kind of talked about the well-being sessions, the meditation, yoga. They are important to offer. We're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Some of that stuff is important because for some individuals that will really help them. But we also need to look at the structural stuff. We need to look at the organizational culture. We need to look at the over promotion of managers, inexperienced management, that kind of, we need to do the whole thing. There needs to be a menu of interventions available. Another important conclusion is that prevention and response are really important. So I think somebody mentioned prevention right at the start. I can't remember who it was. Was it Alison? It might have been Alison. We need to think about how we prevent these things from happening, but we also need to think about how we're responding to serious incidents. So in those examples that I shared with you, the case studies that I shared with you at the start, the organisation wasn't looking at those as being a traumatic incident for staff members. It was very much looking at them as being serious incidents for the customers. And maybe we'll offer any of those, those individuals, might offer them a day off, or we might make sure that we get somebody in to do a debrief. But there wasn't a kind of cohesive, robust approach to staff trauma. And then we've talked about the others. So we must start having a trauma-informed approach that includes staff well-being that is not delivered by service managers. So I just wanted to add that there, because sometimes reflective practice or debriefs or clinical supervisions where it's in a group setting includes the service manager, and that can prevent staff members from speaking openly. We need to make sure that there are separate forums for staff members and for managers so that they can have the freedom to really talk openly and to let things off their chest. And we also need an approach that promotes post-traumatic growth. Trauma in itself doesn't have to finish us all, does it? Trauma in itself can lead to positive outcomes. Okay, for anyone who has, I admitted at the start, I've been burnt out. I started my own business and I've gone on to do, I would consider, great things. That's post-traumatic growth. People who have had a divorce, who have had a bereavement, it can lead them to doing amazing things with their lives. It can lead to growth. So if we can have that kind of approach in our work as well, that can be super, super helpful. Alison, your hand's up. Do you want to jump on?
Just on mute. I think someone's asked
Did you put everyone back on screen, Matt? It's nice to see everybody.
Yeah. I can put people on the screen once I've got the slides finished. They will do very soon. That's not a problem at all.
Okay.
Well, I can turn these off now. Is that what you wanted? There we go. We can turn the slides off now.
But I think that point you made there about post-traumatic thing, particularly Jenny, around the service managers, was really, really key, because we've got to also face the fact that our managers are going through trauma. It's anybody who's dealing with this kind of data, you could have 6 people coming into you, kind of they're all burning out, they're all struggling, and you're having to take all of that on. Your managers need this services too. Yes,
absolutely right. Any questions? We've got like 4 minutes left. So does anyone have any questions or any comments or thoughts that they'd like to share?
Vicky's just put in the chat there, I've highlighted a number of times that hybrid working, especially for frontline staff, has been detrimental. Managers have not been able to see if there's an issue, as staff do not always tell you they've had a difficult call or visit. Also, this has caused friction in the team, and many teams and cliques have formed. Just before I bring Alison back in, what are your thoughts on hybrid working, Jenny, in terms of the work that you've been doing with staff?
Hybrid working can really work because it offers staff members the flexibility, this whole idea of work-life balance. It can be really helpful, but it needs to be managed effectively. And for some teams, it just wouldn't work at all. And it's okay that it won't work, but again, that needs to be clearly communicated. What are the reasons for, against, etc. It's not something, I don't think it can just happen organically. There needs to be really clear kind of parameters put in place so that people know what's expected of them, and people do have the coming together time when they need it.
Completely agree. It can, and people actually are really valuing that balance between hybrid, but to me, hybrid has possibilities. Full remote is very, very difficult. Alison,
Yeah, there's a couple of sort of sideways issues to chuck in. One is I think there's police are now going to stop attending mental health call outs. So, for
Yeah.
example, after I had my experience with the body in the cupboard, I never ever, well, I did have to do it a few times, but I know now people tend to ring the police rather than trying to do the bravado thing. But that might become harder with that. And the
Can
other
I
bit,
can I comment on that? Sorry, Alison,
Yeah.
before you
Please do,
go
yeah.
on. So that's just, it's the Metropolitan Police, so it's only affecting those in London. It comes into effect on the 31st of August. I talk about this in some of my training. It's quite interesting to see what protocols organisations are building in to counter this. But the police are saying that they will still come out where there is a threat to life. So it's then really on the, I mean, mostly that's what the teams are feeling like anyway when they need the police, like this person is in danger to themselves or to us. So it may not have a massive impact. It's really an interesting one with that, because the police are overstretched and they shouldn't really be dealing with mental health incidents in the community. It really should be other services, but they do deal with it up until now. So yeah, it's going to be really
That's
interesting to
largely
see how
because
that
all the other
pans out.
services have been cut down to zero, though.
Yeah.
Isn't it? I think it's
Yeah,
part
yeah.
of the problem.
And they don't have the resources themselves to deal with it. The police don't have the resources themselves. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether it really does have much of an impact in practice. We're going to have to wait and see.
The other slightly related issue was, we hear a lot about these. There's been a few recently, hasn't there, where people have been dead in properties for like months.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm back to my normal rant about frontline officers and staff linked a bit to the hybrid working. If we're losing that kind of local knowledge on the ground and visibility, is that making that kind of thing more likely? And obviously, the trauma of finding someone after that length of time. And I know that's not a violent incident necessarily, but there's a lot of there's been 2 or 3 recent examples of people who've been left a long time, and I don't know whether that's harder to pick up on when the whole estate management model's changing.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak of that. Certainly the kinds of organisations that I've worked in, we've not been able to have any hybrid working at all, because we offer 24-hour staffing. We have to be visible with our customers and clients, so it doesn't work in every organisation. Yeah, and you're right, this is a growing problem. We need to have people in contact with our clients and customers. They're vulnerable people for the most part. We need to be out there. We need to be out there making contact. So it'll be interesting to see how that progresses with the various pieces of legislative changes that are coming in.
I'm aware a number of people are having to go due to us reaching our hour slot. I just want to say thank you to Jennie for bringing everything to the table today. I think it's been a really informative session. Lots of positive comments in the chat there at the end on how they found the session and the information delivered. What's the best way for people to get in touch with you for follow-up questions, Jennie?
LinkedIn would be great. Yeah.
No worries at all. It tends to be what I call as well. So do reach out to Jennie.
Just pop the link to the research in the chat. Sorry, Matt, to interrupt you. I've just popped the link for the research into the chat if anyone wants to have a look at that.
I'll make sure that gets shared around as well, so people can have a good look into that. It's interesting actually that Alison mentioned there about staff teams and things. So next week I've got Tom Norris from Places for People. He's one of the managing directors over there. They are obviously a large organisation. We've talked about large organisations versus small organisations on the round table before, and they've massively transformed and in England now are transforming their workforce from having massive patches to small patches again, going back to that community model, cutting maybe some senior roles to fund it, finding ways to make that work, because you need to have smaller patches and people on the ground, and the amazing difference that's showing. So that really kind of ties in a bit in with what we're doing today. But what I do want to just say is thank you for all of the information, Jennie. Thank you for the really candid conversation, because I think sometimes it's very easy to talk around these subjects rather than being honest about them. And to anyone who is watching this on the recording or who's been with us today, please do reach out to Jennie for advice, support, and who knows, maybe some training you can go in and deliver as well. But for now, thank you everybody for joining us this week. Do get in touch if you'd like to be with us next week, and I look forward to speaking to you soon. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.